Hello and welcome to this News in Brief session looking at the aged care reforms. This is our first edition and we recorded this on Wednesday, the 5th of October, 2022. My name is Dale Park and I'm joined by my colleague Lisa Dean, and we're regional advisors for diversity and wellness across the East Metropolitan area of Melbourne. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land of where we're meeting, the Wurundjeri people, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to extend a special welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are viewing this session. So when we think about reform readiness, there's lots to be thinking about as part of this reform agenda. Today is really an opportunity for you to confirm or check your understandings of the reforms that are taking place, to understand consultation opportunities and what you can be doing as part of your transition plan. So we wanted to start off with some of the basics.
We'll start at the beginning, which of course is the new integrated assessment, which will replace the current NSAF. And this, of course, includes the development of a classification framework. So the department has completed what they've called a living lab trial, which is basically a live test of the aged care assessment tools and the processes. And it's involved around 151 assessments of mainstream and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community members by about 24 assessors from both RAS and ACAS services. So the trials have identified that there's some further work that needs to be done in the development of the tools. And this is really around the usability of the tools. So looking at improving some of the language and the structure in the tool, including how it actually captures reablement early within the assessment structure. Other work that they've identified is around decision supports for assessors, so within the functionality of the tool. So, for example, clarifying where assessors do and don't have flexibility within the assessment process, and also making sure that the tailored recommendations for services, that are based on responses to specific questions as given by clients. The third area that's been identified for work is around assessment outcomes, which involves reviewing what they call the classes and the associated service levels and service types. So you might recall that in the initial design of support at home for assessment, what they're trying to do is to group like people within certain classes based on their cognitive capacity, their social connection, and their physical activity. What came out of the trial was that they really need to make sure that they've got those classes correct and right. So the trial is actually going to inform the next steps for assessment, and the intention is that they're actually looking at doing a larger pilot into the future. So it's just something to keep in mind, because certainly the assessment process has an impact for all of us on what it looks like and the clients that are being referred through to service. So we know that the new program is expected to use what we call a service list to describe the different services that clients will be able to access through the program. There was a consultation, I think it was February this year, around the service list, and the department have recently released a paper which provides a summary of the feedback from the sector around those service categories. So some of the recommendations coming back from the sector was about removing the 7 service categories. So you might remember, as part of the design, there were some broad categories. So, for example, independence at home, health and specialised support, and social connections. And each of these service categories have a list of service types within them, and they're like service types. So, for example, in independence home, there was domestic assistance, meals, home maintenance, and digital technology. So the survey respondents expressed some concern about these broad categories. The recommendation was that they be removed. The department has said that the service list will provide a level of flexibility for clients to be able to swap between service categories. And I think what organisations are saying, we'd like the categories to be removed and we want people to be able to move freely between the service types. There was also feedback that some of the services within a category didn't necessarily fit nicely together. So I've given you an example there around nursing and personal care. So some recommendations about re-looking at some of those categories of like services. There was feedback that the services should include a description of whether they're ongoing or ad hoc. And this is probably particularly important when we think about reablement services, which is a short-term intervention and is certainly a key focus of the new program. There was lots of feedback around the new care management activity, and the sector is really keen to ensure that the definition of care management reflects the full scope and that it reflects who can deliver that activity, including any clinical qualifications that will be required. So in the summary report of the survey list feedback, the department have said that they will use this feedback to continue to design the program and the service list, and taking into account some of the feedback around pricing and worker qualifications. Most of you will probably be aware of the Aged and Community Care Providers Association, which is the peak body of aged care providers. And advice that we've received from them is that they expect that the department are positioning themselves to sign off on the Support at Home program and the funding design by December this year. And essentially what they're looking to do is develop a business case to invest or implement by the May 23 budget. So essentially what that would mean is that we would be looking at we'd have the design finalised, and we'd be looking at having a 12-month period of implementation. Just the other thing that we've also heard from ACPA is that we should keep an eye out for a in-home aged care discussion paper from the department that's expected to be released sometime this month. So we're not quite sure what's in that, but certainly something to be looking out for. So I'm going to move on to unit pricing and payment in arrears. And I think this is a really important area, given that the funding model for the support at home is not yet finalised. So it's proposed that the future support at home program is going to align funding with individual clients in most cases. This is really different to how funding is provided now. So at the moment, you get a grant agreement with a block amount of funding, but in the future, you might have a client for allied health services, and that client might decide sometime into the future that they're going to move to another organisation to receive that service, which would mean they will take their funding with them to that service. So it's going to be very different. And the idea is that the new model is going to provide greater client choice about who their service provider is, greater flexibility, that it'll provide better accountability around the use of government monies, and it'll also address some of the issues around unspent funds that we know have been sitting with service providers. So payment in arrears is the first step in facilitating this approach. So we know that you've had a move from upfront quarterly payments to monthly payments, and that commenced as of the 1st of July this year. This change has also been accompanied by more regular performance reporting through to DEX. So that now occurs monthly. And of course, we know that there is new unit prices have been released for program activities, and the department has released these unit prices to support CHSP providers through the transition to payment in arrears, and of course for future reforms in this funding area. It's going to be really important, with the future model, that you actually understand the cost of delivering your service. And this is really about understanding what's driving your cost. Salaries, the material, the vehicle use, and all of the overheads that we know are necessary to deliver one unit of service. And it's also about being able to track the costs of services that you have delivered to each of your clients. The government has clearly stated, I think on many occasions, that providers really should have a client contribution policy in place. And they do take this into account when they're setting their unit prices. So part of understanding where your organisation is going to be sitting in the future in terms of pricing and costing is about ensuring that your client contribution and your fees policies are in place. So we would really encourage you to be looking at those and reviewing and refining them. So the Easter Sector Development Team and our sector support partners are actually going to be offering 2 workshops around understanding the cost of delivering a unit of service. So we're still finalising the events, but they're going to be in person. They're going to be smallish groups, so probably a maximum of 30 people, and we're looking to run them on the 5th and 6th of December. So I really encourage you to keep an eye out for our newsletter, which is where we tend to communicate most of this information. There's been lots of work around funding going on in the background by peak bodies who are advocating for guaranteed funding and are really seeking a change to the funding model that the department have at the moment. And what we wanted to do here was just share some advice that we've received from Troy Spears, who is a senior policy officer with the Aged and Community Care Providers Association in relation to this. So I'm going to just play you a short video.
The key one for CHSP providers is the work of the Support at Home Alliance, which you're probably all aware of, how to set up support at home right the first time. And it's really targeting the need for guaranteed funding. An NDIS funding model will potentially wipe out a lot of services in CHSP because they don't have enough scale. And they may also have service types that are capital resource heavy. So we have real concerns as ACPA around that direction. And the key point to note here is that we have written a letter to the Minister asking for demonstration projects. That's the first step. So that's what the Alliance has done, is written to the Minister around demonstration projects, while the department is going to consultation on their current approach. So we're saying inputs, which is what we're seeing the government focus on. We need demonstration of outputs. We need both inputs and outputs on the table, where the government focusing on inputs, outputs won't come, quality indicators won't come until after they've already put Support at Home in place. So if they've got the settings wrong, it's not getting it right first time. So that's the position of the Alliance, is we need inputs and outputs. Now, at the moment, your CHSP providers have their local account of what are the outputs as a result of the CHSP grant extensions that started 1 July. And part of the advocacy going forward is building that narrative, creating greater visibility on outputs as a result of the SHADS changes, as a result of the indexation on your unit prices, nationally consistent unit prices, expectations around client contributions, and actual availability, workforce and supply availability. So those are the kind of things that I think are going to be important. In transition to Support at Home, we're now coming up to the 3rd month under the grant extension. So the first quarter of implementing care under the new arrangements is currently in process. So note the updated manual. You already done that. There's now monthly activity reporting that needs to be within 10 business days after the end of month. And they're also set your unit price, CHSP provider unit prices, to encourage client contributions. So the work in setting the unit prices actually took off a client contribution component, and you need to deliver and add a client contribution to do what they developed was an aggregated estimate of what the cost to serve was for each service type. That's different to home care packages. The data you'll see on home care packages around prices, $55 an hour for domestic assistance, includes the client contribution. So that's the difference between CHSP prices and home care packages. That's why home care packages will look more generous. But it's important to know that going forward to support at home, depending on where the government lands on client contributions, depends on what the final price point will be.
So further to this advice by ACPA, they're also looking to develop a survey tool to build an evidence-based narrative around the nature and the impact of the funding pressures that providers are experiencing and also how it impacts client care. So they basically intend to conduct a survey and put together a report and propose a change to the funding model for CHSP by late November this year. So we now want to share a video that explains how you might be able to contribute as part of this advocacy work.
Providers need to create visibility on program outputs resulting from the program inputs that government is moving towards. NDIS is a good example of where it's going. Advocating for support at home design and interim CHSP grant arrangements that support quality care, the experiences of your providers' consumers, and the outcomes of the consumers. So you can see SHADs, some of the impacts for quality care, for experiences and outcomes. And there will be a subgroup in anyone's program. Let's say I have 100 care recipients. I might have 10 care recipients that got worse off of that SHADs, and I need to create visibility on those worse offs because the government is just looking at aggregates. We can wear a 10%, loss because we're looking at the future demand. We've got My Aged Care set up as a national registry of demand. We're going to push to get some more quality data on that, but we're going to drive costs down before the Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority comes in after support at home and then generates the evidence regarding what it costs. And then the department having debased home care, can then negotiate up based on what they can actually afford to pay. So that's where they start to trade off. Where can we trim the fat from the cow, so to speak, to make this affordable at a taxpayer level, and what the client contribution will need to be. So we have a position now where we need to make sure that move by the government isn't at the expense of current care recipients. And that's the visibility point that I'm talking to. Quality care experience and outcomes as a result of changes and reform. So this is what I'd be suggesting. We'd be asking CHSP providers to be thinking about strategically in their advocacy approach. For each service type they deliver across the July to September period initially, measure the difference, the percentage difference between what they were informed as their contract number of outputs and their actual activity outputs they measured. Now, some providers might be delivering the same quality, so they under-deliver on activity. So there's no change in quality, or there's minimal change in quality, but they're under-delivering, and they're arguing that point. The other is people are delivering to the contracted price and they're reducing what they're offering consumers. So consumers are getting a lesser service. For transport, you can only travel so far. We can't take you to where we used to take you, which might be what you need, but we can't afford it. So that measurement of the difference between contract and activity outputs is important. But alongside that, the second point, describe the client impacts and change in their client's experience and outcomes. Observe for each of those service types that goes alongside with that change. All right. And capturing client feedback to build that narrative on what you're seeing. Now, that information, if it's tabled and managed, can be used to advocate. CHE providers can have a voice. They can communicate, this is what we've captured to their funding agreement manager. They can send it to their local MPs and through peak bodies and the media. and you can create that visibility around some of the changes that have been introduced in terms of client quality care experiences and outcomes, because that's all the government cares about. They don't care too much about providers. They can wear some consolidation, but losing your local community centre and your local provider is not in the best interest of old Australians. You know, we don't want just Woolworths and Coles. We need choice in the market, and consumers can choose what they want. But it's got to be funded at that level. If we lose it all we're going to do is in 5 years' time get a review that says we need to put more money in. But we've lost the local infrastructure in the process, and a valuable workforce that's just gone somewhere else. And now we've got to start from scratch again, which is just not getting it right the first time.
So another area of reform that will really need to be thought about and considered is around our information technology and our data. So the Department of Health and Aged Care are exploring options for a new payment platform, which should enable the payment and reporting of government subsidies and client contributions, with an option for client bookings where appropriate. You will need to ensure that your client data is accurate, complete, and up to date so that data can be matched appropriately. And we really can't stress that enough. For all of this to work effectively and for you to be able to be paid correctly, this will be absolutely critical. Supporting these reforms is a consultation which is in progress with providers around the design of the payment platform. There is a survey to understand how organisations currently manage in-home aged care client bookings, staff rostering, invoicing and payments and reporting, and how these systems could be complemented within this new payment platform. So again, this is something that we really encourage you to be part of. It does close soon on the 14th of October. So we really do encourage you to participate. And when we say you, it may not be your direct role or responsibility, but who is the person within the organization that should be taking this bit forward? And I think that's a really important point across all of these areas. You can't necessarily be the point of contact or the expert across all of them. This needs to be a shared understanding and responsibility within the organization. So with this particular survey, what they really need is input from your operations, finance, accounting, and rostering teams. Now, this will obviously depend on the structure and size of your organization.
So we're now going to move on and have a look at some of the work that's happening around the regulatory framework. So we know that there's work in progress to refine the aged care regulatory framework, which it primarily sets out the rules and guidance to ensure that people are receiving high quality care. And a key component of the current framework that we'd all be very familiar with would be the aged care quality standards. So the review is being conducted in 4 stages. So in February this year, the department released a concept paper which provided insights into some of their ideas about what changes to aged care regulation might include. So this paper was actually put out for consultation, and the ideas have been further explored in the recently released consultation paper, which provides a high-level overview of what the proposed new model would look like, which includes 13 regulatory tools. So you can see here on your screen, this includes things like incident reporting, the quality standards, and a code of conduct, to mention a few. But it also includes some new areas around registration and screening processes for service providers. So the model will be underpinned by 4 key foundations. It will be a rights-based approach. So really, this is about ensuring that the protections are in place to uphold the rights of older Australians. So it will also be person-centred, so placing the needs, the goals, values and preferences of older people at the centre of the regulatory model. It will follow a proportionate risk-based approach. which really provides the regulator with a lot more flexibility in how they do their work. And in a proportionate risk-based approach, the responsibility of providers and the regulatory response by the Commission might differ depending on the type of services being delivered, the settings in which they're being delivered, and who is actually delivering the service. And I suppose the idea of this new approach is that the focus of regulatory efforts will be the greatest where there is the greatest risk of harm. So I suppose if you think about the risks associated with delivering a nursing service as opposed to delivering a social support activity, they could be quite different. The model will also seek to support an ongoing commitment to improve the capability and the quality of the aged care sector through continuous improvement. So what this might look like in practice is that as a first response, the regulator might engage with organisations around education and engagement rather than moving straight into some stricter form of compliance. So the department is currently seeking input on the consultation paper that we just spoke about, and you can provide written feedback or respond to a questionnaire, which is really asking a series of questions to understand the extent to which you think the model will address some of the current issues within our regulatory system, how it might be improved, and what might be the benefits and drawbacks of the proposed risk-based approach. There will also be an opportunity to register for some upcoming workshops around this consultation paper, and they're available on the Consultation Hub. And the written feedback around the consultation paper closes on October the 10th. So the remaining two stages of the review of the regulatory framework will occur in late 22 and early 2023, when we should expect a consultation paper around the transition arrangements to the new approach. There is lots of information available, and we've included them in the links on our website. So more recently, consultation has commenced around the revised aged care quality standards, and you may have received notification that the department's hosting a webinar on Monday, the 17th of October. So this webinar will really explore some of the work that's been done to date and what the proposed changes might look like. We've actually received advice from ACPA that they'll be very similar to what we've always known them to be, but there is certainly some tweaking. And that you should probably expect to receive access to the new draft standards sometime after the webinar, at which time you'll be invited to provide feedback around the proposed changes through to mid-late November. The department is running a series of focus groups, so there's 9 in total, and you can go in and register for those, but I will say I think they're limiting it to 1 person per organisation, so you probably need to coordinate across your organisation about who attends those. The focus groups are around each of the individual standards, and there is a broader home care focus group scheduled for the 15th of November. There is also consultation available for families and carers, so we would certainly encourage you to be sharing information about those consultations with your clients and your community members.
The next area we thought was really important to discuss was the Serious Incident Response Scheme. And this is now being extended to in-home care from the 1st of December 2022. So the Aged Care and Other Legislation Amendment Bill, as part of the Royal Commission response, was passed by the government on the 2nd of August. The subordinate legislation currently is being drafted, and this contains the detail, the what, the how, and it is expected shortly. What we do know is that these changes are included in your organisation's current grant extension agreement, and CERS, as it's being referred to, sets out the arrangements to prevent and manage incidents and to notify all reportable incidents that occur or are alleged or suspected to have occurred. And that's about reporting them to the Aged Care Quality Commission and the police where it's reasonable. So in regards to the Serious Incident Response Scheme, you must have an incident management system in place, and it must include policies and procedures, tools, education and communication, governance, and accountability. So providers can prepare by reviewing and ensuring that they're aware of their general incident management system and their obligations under that. ACPA have asked the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission to undertake a risk proportionate approach to early stage intervention of their responsibilities for the serious incident response scheme within home care, noting that it would be varied around provider capacity to be fully compliant by the 1st of December. But providers do need to demonstrate intent to implement. So it's really important that staff and the organization are acclimatized and that they understand what is their responsibility. And not only what their responsibility is, but ultimately this is about protecting and supporting the rights and dignity of older people. So there's a real value for your organization to be at the forefront of this. So as with all of the reform areas, there's information, training, and education that's available. We are running an online change forum on Wednesday, the 18th of October from 9:30 a.m. And we will look at the requirements under the Serious Incident Response Scheme. The Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission has a range of resources, including a webinar that was recorded on the 26th of September, and it's available to view on their YouTube channel. You can also register to access free bite-sized learnings via the ALIS Learning Hub, where they also have training and education around serious incident response schemes. We also highly recommend that you register for Effective Incident Management Workshop through the Aged Care Quality Standards. And we also think it's really important that you connect and link in to the recently created articles. There's 6 of them in the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission's bulletin that has been released. The next area of reform that we've already been speaking with you about and will continue to throughout the year is around the specialisation verification framework. So the specialisation verification framework, for those who may not be aware, is a process of confirming and certifying that a provider has demonstrated their ability to deliver their services to one of the 9 special needs groups in accordance with specific criteria. Once verified, a provider can promote their specialisation on My Aged Care via the Find a Provider tool. The framework provides a detailed criteria of evidence and a guide to support providers and their application. And applications are now open for independent assessment, which is carried out by Australian Health Associates. And a really important thing, if you currently have a specialisation claim on your My Aged Care, if it is not verified, it will be removed by early 2023. So if this is something that is important to you, and we hope that it is, we really encourage you to look into the specialisation verification framework and how you can meet the necessary criteria. In terms of useful resources and information, we have completed a webinar that's available on our website, which goes through all the information and all the criteria. There's also the Department of Health and Aged Care, who are having a webinar around specialisation verification on the 11th of October, and they also have the provider guidance documentation, which goes into all the detail about the framework. Moving on to, I guess, one of the key reform areas around the navigation for older people. Again, this is an area that we've done a bit of work on, looking at the Care Finder program. So the new Care Finder program will commence in January 2023. And we know that it is similar to the Victorian Access and Support Program, but there is differences within that. And importantly, care finders will complement, not duplicate, current aged care entry points. And the target population is focused on people who are eligible for aged care services, who have one or more reasons for requiring intensive support to access aged care services and or other relevant supports in the community. Alongside the Care Finder program, there's the Trusted Indigenous Facilitator program, which will be commencing in mid-2023. At the moment, we are awaiting announcements of the successful Care Finder organisations from the PHN tender process, and we look forward to working with and supporting the rollout of the Care Finders once they're in place. And in terms of useful information and resources, as I mentioned, we have our webinar available on our website that goes into this in quite a bit of detail. And the Department of Health and Aged Care have a policy guidance document which explains all about how the Care Finder program will operate and how it will run throughout Australia.
So there are some future considerations that you're going to need to be thinking about in addition to what we've addressed today. So we don't necessarily have time to cover all of these today, but we thought it's certainly something that we will cover in a future session. And some of these include changes to the requirement for approved provider or registration status and what that might mean for your organisations in getting ready for that as of 1st of July 2024. You may be aware that a new aged care code of conduct is coming into the aged care sector from the 1st of December 2022. Now, this will only apply to residential and current approved home care providers at the moment. So it does not apply to CHSP organisations. But essentially what the Code of Conduct will do is it sets out a standard of expected behaviours of aged care organisations, their governing bodies and their staff. So the code was actually released yesterday by the department. So we have included links if you're interested in going and having a look. And while it doesn't apply to your organisation at this stage, it will be considered a best practice. And we would really encourage you to have a look and familiarise yourself with that. There are also new governance requirements that will apply to residential and current approved providers by the 1st of December 2022. So this is essentially requiring changes to the makeup of your governing boards, the requirements for a consumer and clinical governance advisory groups, and mandatory notification around changing key personnel within an organisation. Again, this does not apply to CHSP only providers, but there is potential for it to impact you into the future. Worker registration was one of the areas that has been identified in the new regulatory framework, something to think about for the future. And finally, there's also some work going on in residential aged care around quality indicators. So Flinders University have developed a client quality of life and care experience surveys, which will become mandatory for residential care. We know that the government is very interested in moving to an outcome-based focus and collecting more meaningful data. So I think this is really something to keep an eye on in our space, and Flinders University is certainly looking at how those tools might be tailored to support in-home support services.
So we just wanted to wrap up, I guess, with a bit of a reminder about service model and approaches, because even though we're going through all of this reform, there's some really key areas that underpin all of our work, obviously around the diversity, wellness and reablement space. Whilst we're going through these reforms, we have to keep on top of all of that as well and really embed these approaches within our current and future practice. So the first one is around knowing your community and being proactive to really understand who is and isn't accessing your services and who's not represented and how they can have a voice and be represented within your service. The follow on from that is to engage consumers to understand their needs, their preferences, what their interests are. The new program will offer greater level of choice for clients. So it's going to be all the more important for you to ensure that you are offering services and a service model that people are going to want to use. For example, is a traditional social support group what people want, or is it something different? When we think about knowing your community and understanding your consumers and their needs, it's likely that the relationships and partnerships that you develop will be absolutely vital in this. So we encourage you to think about, what are your existing partnerships and relationships? Have you got room for developing new ones? Is it an opportunity to nurture and refresh the ones that you have? Around communication, we think moving into the future, it's really going to be more important than ever that you have a good understanding of who your target audience is. Knowing who they are, what's important to them, and how they get their information will be really important. So we want to think about how you describe your services, their eligibility, and think about how you communicate your offer to the consumers that are out there. And finally, and this was really, I think, talked about quite strongly in Troy's video, we really encourage you to collect information to understand the impact of your service on your clients. So think about the client outcomes, the client experience from using your service, and the change as a result of accessing your service. And to be able to build your program around that will be really important into the future. So I mentioned that we've created a website with all of the links that we've talked about today. It's on our ESD website under the Aged Care Reform tab, or you can go to esdt.com.au/news in brief. So that's everything from this session. We hope you found that useful, and we really want to stress the importance of being connected into our e-newsletter, because this is where we'll be sharing all the information about the upcoming workshops and training and education and reforms. We've been very fortunate to form a partnership with a number of organizations, which means that we're going to be able to offer even more workshops and education and things like that. If you don't want to miss out, we highly recommend that you keep up to date with the newsletters. And if there's other people in your organization who need to be on that list, to contact us and let us know.
We will continue to run these news in brief sessions as changes are happening, and to help you keep up to date with the reform activities.